And thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Appreciate the Western Dakota Energy Association. I was privileged to sit on the board of this organization in the 90s into the early 2000s when it was the North Dakota Association of Oil and Gas Producing Counties, which we hated the name because nobody could ever remember that one, but I'm glad you changed that after I got off the board. So what's been happening with this measure is that in the last, since it came out and came on the ballot, one of the things in the legislature that we don't have is communications people. So we don't have any way to get information out, factual information out for people when things like this pop up, or even for the things we do during the legislative sessions. We're trying to change that this next session and try to get some communications people on board to help us out. But we do a lot of things that people don't know about. You heard about transparency in the last presentation by Reese, so this is part of that. I'll preface it by saying I'm not here speaking in favor or opposition of the measure. What I am here to do is to show you the facts as the Appropriations Chairman of the Senate related to the numbers, and also I'll give you some anecdotal evidence or information from the City of Williston, where I've served as the Finance Commissioner now for 29 years. So I have a perspective on both sides of this measure. Again, my personal opinions do not reflect anything legislatively or the legislature, and I'm not here for or against. So at the end, we'll take some questions on what I give you here. These slides I presented, if you were at the Tioga presentation a week ago or so, I apologize, you're going to see them again. These were propagated by former Senator Rich Wardner, a good friend of mine out of Dickinson, and he has a much lengthier slide presentation. This, I've pared it down to about 20-some slides, I think, from almost 60, just the ones that I think would be most meaningful for a short presentation. So next slide, please. So this is the history of property tax. So in 1981, the legislature established 4 classifications of property assessment. There's commercial, agricultural, residential, and centrally assessed. By the way, I'll go back a little bit from this. Property tax has existed in the United States of America for about 200 years at some level or some means. So it's nothing new, and it's been here that long. It's never been rescinded anywhere else. And even the Tax Foundation, in testimony to our Tax Relief Committee in Bismarck, has told us that it's standed that long and still stands because it really is the most fair and equitable system that provides revenue at the most local jurisdictional entity that we have in government, which is schools, cities, and parks, and other classes. Oh, okay, so I can do this? Yes. You have to tell me how to do it, but there's a little arrow button. Okay, I'll use it. So the 4 classifications, this is pretty much the same no matter where you go in the country. I've served on some national tax boards in the past. Every state has commercial, agricultural, residential, and centrally assessed. Some states have created a 5th classification called primary residential. So they have further divided primary residential out of residential. And when you look at it, that makes some sense because commercial, agriculturally, and centrally assessed properties, which are the industrial properties like the transmission lines, the pipelines, the gas plants, the railroads, those types of entities, all of those classification of properties are income producing. Residential is not income producing. Unless it's residential in our classification where you have 4 or 4 units in the residential property, you might be renting out. So when you go to a primary residential, you can designate a classification that is your home, which is not income producing, but the other residential properties would fall into the residential category then because they would be income producing. In 1981, they equalized assessments across the state. The assessment process, this is important, the assessment process is a local process. They're either county assessors or city assessors or both in all these jurisdictions that do that process. The state provides guidance and guidelines on how to do it, and the state provides training resources on how to train the personnel to do it, and that is to try and equalize the process across the whole state. You changed ag land from a market value to a production formula. NDSU goes out and surveys land all around North Dakota, and has been doing this for decades, and they test the soils for its productivity index, and they created the index, and your property taxes are based on your productivity index, which makes sense. You can understand that the value of property in Red River Valley is much better than it is in parts of western Williams County, just because the productivity index is higher for growing crops there. Preserved levy authority of political subdivisions, and gradually brought taxable value of centrally assessed property online. Okay, this is to understand what's on the ballot. Number one, tax relief. If the state replaces the estimated local property tax in the year 2024, the estimated amount is $3.15 billion for the biennium. And that was provided to us by the tax commissioner in testimony to the legislative management team. The initial estimates on this from Legislative Council were a little over $2.6 billion for the biennium. The discrepancy is Legislative Council took actual taxed receipts for the year 2022 and 2023, which they could base it off of. The measure says it's not taxes paid or assessed in 2024, it's the taxes levied. We're just now going through that levy process in all our political subdivisions. The counties, what is today? Is it today the 10th of October? Today's the day that local political subdivisions have to have into the county offices their tax levy for 2024. So that number, we won't even know the number of the taxes levied probably until December, and hopefully in January before the session starts we'll know that. The tax commissioner office gave us his best estimate of $3.15 billion versus the $2.6 billion from Legislative Council. Tax reform. No longer will property taxes be calculated on assessed valuation of property starting January 1st, 2025, except to pay off existing bonds and debt. So I'm a little bit unclear on how this works because the valuation process is eliminated. The assessment valuation process is eliminated by the measure, but we still have to pay off existing bonds and debt. If you have general obligation bonds, which school districts, that's how they build schools. If your city has general obligation bonds or your park district has general obligation bonds, and they're still existing after January 1st, 2025, you will still be assessed. You'll still get a property tax bill for those taxes to be paid to pay off the bonds for those improvements. So it won't eliminate you getting a property tax bill. It will just change the amount of the tax bill. This is interesting to me too, is because North Dakota, and we hear this from the governor all the time, North Dakota does not levy a property tax. It's a local jurisdictional property tax that's being levied. The one exception is 1 mil is levied statewide for the UND Medical School. And this is an area where I've tried to promote some reform because I don't want the state to levy any property tax. But guess what? This 1 mil is a constitutional provision. It's in the Constitution. We can't change that with the legislature. It takes the public to vote on a measure to change that. Now, obviously, if we took away that, if it was taken away in a vote of the public, the legislature would obviously backfill the amount of money at least that the Grand Forks School is getting because you can't shut down the school. But this is the one exception. State budget. This is a telling slide for Western Dakota Energy Association. These are our counties involved in energy production in North Dakota with oil and gas and coal. This is the area that will, and we shouldn't kid ourselves about this, this is the area that will pay for the elimination of property tax at the state level. This area will pay for the elimination of property taxes for everybody in the state, not just for your jurisdictional areas. Because let's not kid ourselves, the bulk of the revenue for the state, over 55% of state revenues, are generated from oil, coal, and gas taxes. This biennium alone was projected to be about $5.1 billion in oil and gas taxes. My prediction, based on our current estimates, is we're going to hit close to $6 billion in oil and gas tax revenue this biennium. These are the constitutional funds. These are in the Constitution, either voted on by the public or at inception of the state. The legacy fund gets 30% of the oil and gas tax revenues, which is $1.34 billion. It will actually be closer to $1.8 billion in my mind, maybe even get closer to $2 billion when the biennium ends next June. Common Schools Trust Fund gets 5% of the oil and gas revenue stream per year. Foundation Aid Stabilization gets 5%. Resources Trust Fund 10.25%. So there's a total constitutional of 50.25%. And these are annual amounts, because the Common Schools Trust Fund actually gets 10% in the biennium, and so does the Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund. Resources Trust Fund gets 20.5% in the biennium. In lieu of local property tax, this is where it's important for this association. Counties get a distribution from the oil and gas taxes of 54% of the total of political subdivisions goes to counties, or $368.1 million. Again, it'll be a higher number because oil and gas taxes have exceeded our projections, because the legislature sets a production number for the biennium and we set a price number, and that's what we base our revenue projections on. So far this biennium we have exceeded production and we've exceeded in price, so there's more money coming in. Cities get about $221.8 million, schools get I can't see, 68.4 million, and townships get 24.1. So total, this is to the western counties involved in energy production. We're projected to get $682.4 million back in distributions for the oil and gas tax. This biennium, it's going to be a larger number than that. I project it's going to be closer to $800 million by the time we're done. We also have buckets of oil and gas tax distribution at the state. And we call them buckets because what happens is, as the money comes into the state, it drops into the first bucket. When that bucket fills, it overspills to the next bucket. When that bucket fills, it overspills to the next bucket. And there's a reason for that, is because the buckets are set up in a prioritization order. The legislature has determined this is the highest priority and we're going to fill this bucket first and down the line. So the general fund gets the first bucket of $460 million. Now remember, the state will take in about $6 billion in oil and gas taxes. The general fund only gets $460 million of that in an allocation. The next fund is the tax relief fund. That's a social services fund. The legislature set up that bucket high in the priority list to try and provide some tax relief many sessions ago. We dedicated that fund in a bill in 2017 to pay for county social services administration. It's the only part of the social services programs in the state that the counties were levying a tax, a property tax, to pay for the administrative services in their counties. We took that on at the state now, and it's a $250 million biennium expense. Counties, by the way, we removed a 20 mil property tax levy authority when we did that at the state. So right away, 20 mils came off the ability for counties to tax. We thought that was tax relief. Public employees retirement. Our public employees retirement plan, like many plans in the 2009 to 2010, 2008 financial meltdown, lost a lot of its valuation. It's a defined benefit plan. The state has an obligation to make sure that the money is there to pay those benefits, and so we've had to buttress that fund. You'll see a bucket here for $65 million. The fund right now is about 73% full, but it has to get to 100% 30 years or 40 years down the road. So this $65 million injection bucket, every biennium, is designed to do that, to gradually fill us back up so we can provide the commitment to state employees that was promised to them. Strategic Investment, Infrastructure Investment Fund, our SIF fund, you'll hear that a lot. That's $400 million bucket. The SIF fund is a fund that developed from the Permanent Oil and Gas Tax Trust Fund back in the early 2000s, which was never really permanent. What the legislature did is, when the money came in there and they needed money to balance the budget, they went into the Permanent Oil and Gas Tax Fund. So everybody said, well, that's not permanent. I've always called it general fund too, because it's accessible for general fund expenditures. So that's $400 million. When the state needs money, legislature needs money to balance the budget, this is where we go to get more money in the general fund, is the SIF fund. Non-oil cities infrastructure, the Prairie Dog Fund for counties, cities, and townships for the rest of the state and the small oil and gas production areas. That's $230 million. That bucket, and then the airports get a $20 million allocation as well. That bucket will fill this biennium, and it will be distributed out probably sometime in, I'm guessing, February of next year. SIF Fund number 2, that's the last bucket in these buckets coming down. And whatever is left over after all the buckets are filled goes back into SIF, which can help the general fund if it's needed. That's projected to get $54 million. So the total buckets there is about $1.5 billion as well. So here we have the expenditures of oil and gas taxes. Constitutional funds are about $2.2 billion. Large bucket funds, $1.5 billion. Small buckets, $77 million. In lieu of property taxes, that's the distributions to the western oil-producing counties of $682 million. And the tribal share, can't forget that the tribes get a share of this as well, because Fort Berthold produces at any given time 25 to 30% of the production in North Dakota is on the reservation lands, their sovereign lands. They get a distribution of oil and gas tax of $670 million. So that's the $5.14 billion of oil and gas taxes we're expected to collect. So here's our total state budget, $19.6 billion this biennium. General funds are $6.1 billion of that. We've talked about general funds, that's oil and gas taxes and general funds. Special funds of $7.3 billion, federal funds of $6.2 billion, total for $19.6. This slide will be important in the discussion for the measure. I'm going to go back to this slide, and I want to make that point before we go into this. When it comes to the property tax measure funding, the elimination of the property tax, federal funds have provisions that we cannot spend federal funds that the state of North Dakota gets in any way but how they tell us to spend them. And so we cannot use federal funds for property tax relief under this measure. Special funds are funds like your premiums you pay to workers' compensation for the insurance, your hunting licenses through Game and Fish. They're generally service payment funds and cannot be used for property tax relief. Included in that special funds is a strategic investment improvement fund, which those monies can be diverted to the general fund to use. So there's a little caveat here. Of the total $7.3 billion, there is some money that could be diverted for special funds, but it's not the $7.3 billion. And then the general funds of $6.1 billion, that's where the $3.15 billion is going to have to come from. So you can see the diversion of roughly a little over half of our general fund spending is going to have to be diverted to pay for elimination of property tax. Assistance political subdivisions, I think this is important to point out because the legislature, for all its failings and all the criticism, has tried historically to help in property taxes. Again, remembering the state does not levy property tax. That's a local tax issue. So property tax reform, $1.8 billion is what's going out this session or this biennium. Resources Trust water projects paid by oil and gas taxes, $783 million that goes to help with cost shares for city projects, cost shares for rural water projects, cost shares for flood control projects. That's $783 million. The Common Schools Trust Fund earnings. The Common Schools Trust Fund was set up by the Enabling Act in 1889 when the state became a state from the federal government, and they gave the state title to sections 16 and 36 in every township. We call them the school sections. And the earnings from those school section lands, whether it be rental or in the past there had been some sales of those properties, now it's predominantly oil and gas and coal leases. $510 million. There's a formula that distributes the money. There's actually $6.4 billion in the Common Schools Trust Fund right now, but the formula allocation gave us this biennium $510 million to help with education. The state uses that $510 million to pay the $11,000 per pupil we pay local school districts to help with operating costs. So the Common Schools Trust Fund gives that money up. In lieu of property tax, Royal County is the 682. State aid, that's 243. State aid is sales tax dollars that the state gets We have a 5% state sales tax. There's a distribution formula where the state sends back to political subdivisions on a per population basis sales tax amounts. For the city of Williston, this biennium, it's going to amount to about $2.2 million. It's a significant chunk of change the state is sharing from sales tax. And then the fuel and gas tax distribution is $187 million. So any one or a combination of these items would have to occur to cover the debt. Increase income and sales taxes. That has to be a possibility for the appropriations and the legislature to look at. Cut the aid to political subdivisions and move it to state aid property taxes. So if that were to happen, if number 2 had happened, and I suggested it would be the same for all of your political subdivisions, western North Dakota, from Williston's point of view, we would get our $5.5 million in property taxes paid on behalf of the taxpayers from the state to us. We'd get that $5.5 million. But what we would lose in distributions from oil and gas taxes, state aid taxes, and highway taxes is another $38 million, potentially, if we took it all away. So the net negative to the city of Williston's budget would be about $33 million a year, 66 a biennium. We could spend the principal of the legacy fund. The legislature, by the measure passed by the public, has the ability to spend up to 15% of the legacy fund per biennium, with a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate agreeing. Right now, that would be about $1.5 billion based on the trust fund. We could throw that into the pot. But when you do that, you decrease the value of the fund for the future generations to use when oil and gas taxes are gone. Remember, the legacy fund was passed by the public as a measure, initiated measure, to set aside oil and gas tax revenues today. So when oil and gas taxes, that you've seen how big they're coming in now, when those taxes no longer come in, we have a place to go to get the revenue sources we need to maintain government services without coming back and taxing the public that exists at that time. Price of oil would need to average $100 per barrel at 1.3 million barrels per day for at least the next 8 years. I'm not a predictor of that. I can tell you in the 2015 to 2017 session, oil prices collapsed and production collapsed. We had $5 billion in revenue in the 2015 year. By 2017, it was under $2.6 billion, almost cut in half in that 2-year period. So that's a little bit risky in my mind. And then the stock market must average, legacy fund has to average 9.5% earnings annually. And that's if we took all the earnings out. We have a formula where we don't do that right now. So billions in assets, they're $28 billion. So $20.6 billion is in those constitutional funds you see on the other side. Common Schools Trust Fund of $6.9 billion. We can't use that for this. Legacy Fund, we can use portions of that for this. Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund for schools, we can't touch that. And others is $1.3 billion. So 20.6 in those funds. 5.3 billion of the 28 billion is in retirement funds for PERS and teachers' retirement. So those are protected funds that can only be used for the benefit of those beneficiaries. 1.6 billion is for dedicated funds. So about $500 million is appropriated that could be used. 131 million that's not dedicated could be used for property tax relief. The impact if it passes. Many people in the public that I've talked to about this, when they ask me about it, don't realize that the measure, when you remove the assessment evaluation process, it takes away the property tax levies for all classes of property, not just residential, but all the income producing as well. So BNSF Railroad, which has a valuation of about $66 billion, will never pay another dime of property tax in North Dakota. These are the other companies that pay out-of-state commercial properties that pay property taxes. It's about 37 to 40% of your local tax bill is paid by these types of entities. And I guess if they don't pay property tax, it goes back to their shareholders. How will local political subdivisions deal with this? Of those, there are counties, cities, townships, school districts, park districts, fire districts. Fire districts, I'm told, their only revenue source is property tax levy. So we're going to have to figure out in the legislature, if this passes, how are we going to fund ambulance and fire districts? We have to take care of public safety. Here's increases in local funding. The measure says we have to pay the amount of money that's levied in 2024. There's no inflationary factor in the measure. There's nothing that says we have to pay more. In fact, I would say with the language that restrictive, we can only pay the 2024 amount. So as the years go on and your political subdivisions need more money, they can do these things. Beg the legislature, increase fees on water and sewer, institute a local sales tax, institute a fee where property owners pay by the square foot or acres. That could be instituted if the legislature went around with that. Institute an infrastructure fee like specials. Institute a public safety fee where you pay for a police or fire call. And institute an inflationary increase tax. There will be no more uniformity in K-12 education because you don't have the property tax system to support that either. So of those, here's my concern for rural North Dakota. Beg the legislature, Granora, a town of 200 people with a school with about 200 kids in it, has 3 legislators in Bismarck of the 141. Fargo in Cass County has 33 legislators. Who do you think is going to win that war? It's going to be benefiting cities way more than the rural areas if you have to come to the legislature. Increased fees on water and sewer. You can only ask a rural resident to pay so much, and they just are priced out of that system. A local sales tax, again, Granora, I'll use them for example because they're close to where I'm at. Granora doesn't have any commercial businesses other than 2 bars and a gas station. So where are they going to make up that difference? A large city could make that difference up. And then a public safety fee, that's going to be difficult too. So, but these are options that will have to be looked at if the measure passes. There are no U.S. states without property tax, so eliminating it doesn't eliminate the funding problem. It's a diversion of this person not paying it anymore, but this entity covering it for them. So that's the extent of my slides. Again, I hope I've given you some numbers that make some sense up here. They're large numbers to deal with, but they're important numbers, and they're really important for the Western Dakota Energy Association. So I'm glad I had the opportunity to be here to talk about it. And I'd be happy, if we're still on time, Leslie, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
You've covered it.
Okay. Well, thank you for your attention, and good luck the rest of the conference.